In the swinging 60s, Scottish workers at the Linwood factory near Paisley produced a sexy, shiny motor car. It was called the Hillman Imp. It took the motoring world by storm.
The talk of the motoring industry for months has arrived. The Hillman Imp, made in Scotland.
When you first seen one out in the road that maybe someone had bought, you felt, that helped make a bit of that, yeah?
It was a lovely wee car, and it was unusual in the fact that it had an engine in the back, which no British car I don't think had at that time. And it was great, I thoroughly enjoyed driving it.
Owned by the Roots family, the Imp had a revolutionary design. An automatic choke and a rear engine made of aluminium. It was the car of the future.
It was a lovely wee car. We felt quite honoured to have been the kind of first people to help build it.
The Hillman Imp was the first car manufactured in Scotland in 35 years. The workers at Linwood operated in a national climate of strong unions and better living conditions. With shipbuilding jobs decreasing on the lower Clyde, workers flocked to the Roots factory in Linwood, a British family firm with high pay and the greatest employer in town.
I was a bus driver. Never seen a machine before. You know, you told lies to get in. You'd say, oh, I work machines.
This is the place to be, there's going to be money there, long-term employment.
It's people who had never earned a great deal of money in their life and they didn't have very much. When they came to the factory, then the money was, plenty.
In 1963, viewers saw the Linwood plant officially opened by royalty.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to declare this, whatever it is, open. Press the button.
Just everything to be spick and span, and he walked along the line.
The eyes of the world were on the progress of this little car and the people who made it. The Hillman Imp was created in Linwood thanks to a conservative regional development scheme which aimed to bring jobs to Scotland's unemployed. Much of traditional heavy industry was flagging. And light industry was the way forward.
Our regional development policy has been with us a long time. It emerged in practical form as we were coming out of the war, addressing the fact that unemployment levels in particular were probably twice as high in Wales and Scotland and other remoter regions as they were in the national average. And a lot of measures were introduced to try and give government grants to new factories, to new businesses in the regions.
So our job was to reverse deindustrialisation and sustain industrial manufacture and the skill that went into it. It was to get jobs to the workers rather than, as in the old days, workers would get on their bikes and come south where they thought there might be work.
Linwood was one of many projects in Scotland. Vast sums were invested to encourage the British Motor Company to build a site in Bathgate. And to persuade Colvilles to base a steel mill at Ravenscraig, creating thousands of jobs. Roots was handed £10 million of taxpayers' money to persuade them to settle in Linwood. The heart of the car industry was in the Midlands. The larger car firms had snapped up regional development schemes close by in Merseyside, whereas Linwood was over 300 miles away from the Roots base in Coventry.
They were really bullied into it for political reasons. I went up to Scotland with another high-ranking officer of Roots. We put in a report saying it's going to be uneconomic, everything will have to be carried up there. There's a workforce in Coventry. And we had lots of land at Brighton in Coventry. We had a factory in Coventry. We had all the suppliers round about. We said it will be a disaster. So Lesro and I nearly got fired.
But optimism and employment won the day over logistics. Over 5,000 jobs were to be created and 150,000 quality Scottish cars were expected to roll off Linwood's track every year. Everyone was looking forward.
The work people and management whom we've recruited in Scotland and who are now working in our factories are, I think, a most harmonious and enthusiastic team.
Baron Roots couldn't have been more wrong. The unions in Linwood soon found issues worth fighting for.
It was a very routine dispute, but hundreds of people stopped work. And if you look through the cuttings over the years since then, Linwood, 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 strike action.
It was evident that they'd been held under for so many years, and they had an anti-management mindset. They'd got no logical reason to go on strike. You know, they were being paid the best wages you were paid in Scotland. Didn't work any harder than anybody else in the United Kingdom. But it was a mindset, chips on their shoulders like plates.
A car had to come off the track every minute. The men on the line were extensions of the machines. Repeating the same manoeuvre for the duration of their shift.
As soon as the strike started, they were working. I mean, there was no slacking. Impossible to slack.
Every single minute of your working hour or working day was accounted for.
A man on the track could not walk away and go to the toilet or whatever. He had to put his hand up or wait till the guy who was his tag relief came.
Everybody was under great pressure to get cars into showrooms, but the Imp wasn't fully developed. It had problems with its automatic choke, its throttle, and it leaked. Customers weren't happy.
What do you think of the Hillman Imp?
I think it's a piece of rubbish. Some clot forgot to lock over a lock nut in the gearbox.
I've had trouble with the gearbox and I've had trouble with the clutch. And also, they're still having a little trouble with the automatic choke.
They were still pre-production testing the Imp when they were manufacturing it, basically. And of course it was a disaster.
There were also delays getting components from Coventry to Linwood. Workers could be laid off for a day due to the failings of suppliers. The factory wasn't hitting its production targets. In the competitive global car market, this was suicide.
The managers were under a lot of pressure to produce the car and the cars every day and every minute. Therefore, you know, the niceties of trying to communicate and explain things were lost on a great many occasions, and it was just a matter of do what you're told, you know.
We were under pressure, obviously, by the family to produce motor cars, and it was not practical. You couldn't produce them.
It was a brand new concept and a brand new factory and a brand new labour force. I think those three could only lead to trouble.
In 1964, just a year after opening, there were 31 stoppages. The Imp wasn't performing, so Roots was hemorrhaging money. The staff were put on a 4-day week to cut costs. With sour industrial relations, the concept of the modern production line had an Achilles heel. A small strike anywhere down the line could halt production across the entire factory.
If you had someone at the beginning of the process, which was the framing of the vehicle in the first place, if they took industrial action, then it was inevitable that cars couldn't go through to the next part, so they were then affected and they would stop work, and then it would work its way all through that everybody stopped.
With production halted at the start of the line, management were forced to lay off people further down the track.
If you stop a track of motor cars, it doesn't cost you, £100 an hour, it costs you tens of thousands of pounds an hour. And you never catch up.
The union conveners remember trying to solve disputes daily.
I probably argued against people stopping work more than I ever argued for people to stop work. On a day-to-day basis, then we were involved in smoothing the wheels industry rather than anything else.
I'd have liked there were never any stoppage. It made my job a lot easier, but nevertheless, I had to face up to reality.
With hindsight, some of the workers have a different perspective.
They were big men, particularly K Block. They call it the Crazy K because they would go out and strike at the drop of a hat.
I think there were always quite bad feeling there between the workers, shop stewards and the management. I think it was who's going to be in control here, really, and one was as bad as the other.
Different unions were in the power struggle too to get complete power in the factory, because there were 2 or 3 major unions in it. So they were fighting. They had their own agendas to try and get power, which could lead to conflict.
Today, some workers feel that the unions didn't choose their battles carefully enough, going on strike over petty issues which brought bad press.
They installed a machine that you can get them now, you inserted 50p and you get a hot pie, and one Friday the pie thing didn't heat, so they walked out. Total ridiculous.
Anything. I remember going out one day, and we're on strike. What for? I've got cheese in my piece, this guy said. That was the reason.
It was quite embarrassing. I think a lot of us were quite embarrassed at the fact that this big new factory was here. We're all quite happy to work in it, but every week it was a 4-day week or a 3-day week.
They wanted jobs, which was the prime reason politically, for all this money being spent by the government, given to Roots in Linwood, was to provide employment in Scotland. A jolly hard thing to do because they didn't want to work, basically.
But workers felt that management manipulated the situation, purposefully triggering strikes at times when it would be beneficial not to pay their staff.
When cars weren't selling very well, then management initiated disputes.
I didn't agree with the way sometimes the management engineered a strike, and they did. They did engineer strikes.
I mean, we knew that if some place down in England went strike, we wouldn't get parts. So there would be an antagonism at some times to antagonise the unions, so they would walk out, so they wouldn't pay them.
No management orchestrates strikes. You can't afford to have strikes. I say it's a load of nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
Don't go clapping hands! Don't go clapping hands! Go in there!
Linwood wasn't alone. These were passionate times. Strike action was rampaging across the UK, especially the car industry. Trade union leaders now delegated local issues so they could negotiate at a national level, dealing directly with the new Labour Prime Minister of the day, Harold Wilson.
The national trade union leaders were, for many, many years, dealing with the big boys. Tea and scones at Downing Street resolved many problems.
This left local power and decision-making with conveners and shop stewards.
We asked the man concerned if he's prepared to accept a job within his status elsewhere.
Now men on the factory floor had the power to negotiate and get the best deal for their members.
The breakaway from national bargaining in the 60s was common throughout industry. It wasn't just in the motor car industry, but the general tendency was for plant bargaining, and that was the behest of the management as well. They didn't want to be tied up with national agreements, so they basically were insistent.
When you've got power devolved locally, then you've got the ability to apply greater pressure on local employers, and maybe local employers that are doing well. And you should never forget the point of view that the trade union's function is to get the best deal possible for the membership.
If you give power back to the shop floor, then they're going to take it.
The shop stewards became all-powerful in that sense. You know, they decided when they were going to take industrial action rather than the national officials, and they tended to do their own thing.
The shop stewards couldn't act without a vote of support from their members. Every decision was voted for by a show of hands at a mass meeting.
Aye, but it's very difficult to vote against it if you're surrounded by people. Right, we're going to, you know, it's a day off, you know. Aye, okay. And the hand would go up. You know, it's very difficult to, if you're one in 1,500 or 200 people, to go, no, wait a wee minute, you know, because they were always shouted down.
It was just that kind of job it was boredom more than anything else. I mean, people were quite pleased to follow them like lambs.
I'll not say you could feel it, but there was a tension there and there was a bit of intimidation for people to get the right vote.
People may think that it's intimidating because there's 3,000 or 4,000 round about them. They don't wish to speak up, or basically, but that's something the shop stewards or the conveners cannot be responsible for. That's the individual who's responsible for that.
Most union members would never cross a picket line.
If the majority decide that there's going to be a strike, we would expect all the members to accept that. In fact, we would picket the gates to ensure that people did not go in.
You'd be a scab. You know, if you didn't go out and say, you would, you know, you would be a scab.
As inflation increased, the unions pushed for better pay. The nation was racked by strikes. Simultaneously, Harold Wilson was trying to cap wages with an incomes policy. A clash was inevitable.
What you used wages for wasn't necessarily frozen, as prices weren't necessarily frozen.
Once inflation began creeping in, 3%, 4%, 5%, 10% a year, your pay rise matters.
Then in 1966, the seamen went on strike over long hours and low wages.
The men's paying you, you've got to keep on fighting.
Ships were brought to a standstill, costing the country millions of pounds. The government treated the strike as a challenge to the incomes policy and to the state. They declared a state of emergency, bringing in the Navy to clear the docks. The old partnership between Labour and the unions was crumbling. Bad management, strained industrial relations, and striking workers left British companies vulnerable. The reputation of British goods was suffering, including the Imp.
Well, if you continually hear in the press or on the TV that car factory's out on strike again, yeah, people will go off wondering if you're going to get a good product. And I dare say quality did suffer.
Family firms like Roots couldn't compete in a global car industry. In 1967, American multinational Chrysler put in a takeover bid. Britain was losing its industries. Tony Benn, Labour's Minister of Technology, tried to keep roots British.
General Motors owned Vauxhall, they were in Britain. Ford was in Britain. And if we had Chrysler as well, our motor industry would have been entirely controlled by American multinationals. Now, American companies will obviously want to benefit their own people, I fully understand that. So it was an attempt to preserve a British motor industry.
The Imp wasn't performing. The family saw an opportunity of making a bundle. Chrysler were the suckers to buy it.
Chrysler took over a company that had never once hit its production targets, and the Linwood workers found themselves under new American management.
The Americans who came to manage the factory believed that we would be the same as the American unions, where a contract was basically signed in America and the unions actually monitored and basically enforced the contract. That wasn't my role. My role was basically an elected representative of the employees, not a representative of the management.
From the outset of Chrysler's takeover, there were regular stoppages. Politicians were now paying great attention to the sheer scale of strike action across the country. The unions were deemed too powerful, and they were acting locally rather than in the national interest. Harold Wilson was under pressure to bring his trade union supporters to heel.
Well, he was running into problems. There was a lot of pressure on him from big business, a lot of pressure on him from Wall Street and the balance of payments and all the language that used to be used, and he felt that it was only in that way that he would be able to gain control.
Harold Wilson and the government rallied their troops for war. They decided to take on the trade unions. Labour was about to fight its own. In 1969, Barbara Castle, Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity, published a white paper called In Place of Strife. Castle arrived at Rothesay for the STUC conference to demand support for this paper. It proposed legal restrictions on trade union powers, a compulsory 28-day cooling-off period before strike action occurred, and fines on trade unions that held unofficial strikes without ballots. Homes across Scotland saw Castle attempt to justify In Place of Strife to the unions.
Of course, the trade unions are vital to the labour movement. It was the trade unions that created the labour movement. But you know, it cuts both ways. It means also that a Labour government has the right to look to the trade union movement for cooperation.
No cooperation was forthcoming. Key union leaders were Jack Jones and Hugh Scanlon, nicknamed the Terrible Twins. They saw the government threat to union power and they faced it head-on.
Harold Wilson said to Hugh Scanlon, "Get your tanks off my lawn, Hughie." Now, when a Labour Prime Minister is saying that kind of rough thing to a Labour trade union leader, that was the scale of the problem that had to be tackled.
After bitter debates in the House of Commons, Wilson withdrew the paper. 1/3 of the Labour MPs were union-sponsored. Labour was too closely involved with the union movement to fight it. The ordinary worker who voted Labour and was a union member was left with divided loyalties.
At the present day, and I have been a socialist all my life, they've made more mistakes and more excuses, and they've gone back more on the word than any other person, including the Tory, and I detested them years ago.
Disillusioned voters hit the government where it hurt: the ballot box.
this law, the so-called white paper Barbara Castle introduced, just fractured the relations between the Labour government and the unions and cost us, in my opinion, the election defeat of 1970.
In 1970, Wilson was beaten by Conservative Edward Heath. A changing face at Number 10 didn't change industrial relations across Britain. That was something Heath would have to face in the future. But for the moment, the long-term future of Linwood was in jeopardy.
We knew that all our jobs were at stake as well, you know, that all the management, you know, if you've got no business, no cars, no money, you haven't got a job, have you?
Chrysler was losing millions. In 1975, they threatened to pull out of the UK. The government bailed them out to the tune of £55 million if they promised to stay in the United Kingdom. But within 2 years, they sold to Peugeot Talbot. In 1981, the news broke that Peugeot was closing Linwood.
It's finally over. Car production in Scotland has ceased, probably forever.
After the last car came off the track, the workers sent a coffin solemnly down the line. Linwood was laid to rest. In a decade, union power had grown to the point that even a Labour government was trying to check it. In the next 15 years would come the ultimate battle between the government and the unions. Union power would never be the same again.